Hello, y'all. My name is Jay Nicole Ralph. I am light, I am love, and I am a master manifester and transformer out here in these streets. I choose to express my light and my love through my acting, through my producing, through my writing. And today, I get to be the guest host of the Culture Keeper Show. And why am I the guest host of the Culture Keeper Show? Because I get to interview the Culture Keeper himself, a Prince Albert III, Prince the Culture Keeper. Welcome to your own show.
Thank you, Jay Nicole. It feels so weird being on the other side of this. I'm like, that's fine. But no, it's me. I'm here. I'm here. I'm happy to talk, and I'm so happy you joined us, Jay Nicole. Thank you for
I,
hosting the Culture Keeper Show.
you're so welcome. I know that must feel weird. I know.
It's like,
That's
wait,
so dope.
am I late to work? Hold on. But no, I'm here.
Did somebody replace me? What's going on?
Yes.
Right. I am so honored though. I'm so honored because Prince, you are such a good friend of mine. Y'all, he is such you if you're watching this, you probably already know and love Prince and know how much of a light he is in this world and the type of work that he does and how it is so impactful in the world and just how he is a beacon of love and light himself and expressing it in his own ways and the ways that he keeps culture and also shares the way that others keep culture and helps to sustain culture in so many different ways. And so today we get to dive into hoodoo and African traditions, African diasporic traditions. I'm super excited about this topic. As a spiritual person myself, as a person who grew up in the Black church and now a very spiritual person, I'm super excited to dive into that. But before we dive into that, I want to tell you, I gave you how I feel and what Prince is to me, but I'm gonna go ahead and read the official bio so y'all know really what Prince be up in here doing. Okay. So let me just do that right quick. A Prince Albert III, he is affectionately known as the Culture Keeper. He's a revered Afro-Indigenous cultural advocate and scholar, a flourishing social entrepreneur, and a multi-hyphenate artist. He's a filmmaker and a world music DJ. By the way, I just went to one of his events last week where he was DJing. He killed it. He slayed it. He's an amazing, amazing DJ. He's great at all he does. I mean, he's just fantastic. Anyway, he produces content and authors publications on cultural sustainability, cultural lifeways, folklore traditions, and other topics relating to Afro diasporic, Indigenous, and Latinx cultural rights. He is the founder and president of Goldwater Ventures, the parent company of the Culture Keeper Show. Once again, welcome, Prince, to your own show. But go ahead. I want you this time to, if I missed anything or, go ahead and introduce yourself in a way that really you feel expresses you.
Jay Nicole, wow, you got it all. I don't even know. You got it all. Thank you so much. It's a lot of stuff, but it comes from one place, right? The work that I do comes from a place of my heritage, my culture, not something that I read in a book, not something that I, you know, am like discovering for the first time, but traditions and experiences that I was born into, with parents and grandparents and a community of people that are so wise, so brilliant, so resourceful, but the world would look at their resume and think otherwise, right?
Mhm.
And always knowing that the education that I was being afforded was they were tools. It was a means to an end, right? It was a particular language and a vocabulary and a set of skills rather that I wanted to marry and couple with whatever they had, right? Which was off offline, like something that we, didn't necessarily have a school or a tradition or an institution. But I am just so blessed to have been given the opportunity to live in the communities that I do in the Afro, Indigenous, and Latine AIOX communities that I'm from, that are me, and that I work to reflect. My worldview is that everyone gets to go. Everyone
Mm-hmm.
gets to go, right? So the idea that we are being convinced by larger institutions and systems of oppression to use our innate and cultural skills for others' economic gain, but then disavow or disassociate those things from ourselves for ourselves. And it's this game of like parroting where others are trying to be like us and that we're trying to be like others. And in the process, everything and everyone gets erased, right? And
Mm.
no one exists, in the words of a great vice president, Kamala Harris, that what you just fell out of a coconut tree, you exist in the context of history and the world that is around you, right? And even that example shows her origins, right? And her connection to environments and wisdom and soothsaying, right? So that is like the origin of all the things and all the work that I do. And I'm so proud of the fact that like I'm just building a platform for us to celebrate and acknowledge and regain and relearn and revitalize the traditional cultures and belief systems that our grandparents and our parents and our great grandparents, right, practice, but in a structural way, in an academically integrous way, in an ethical way.
Mm-hmm.
So this is going to be a very interesting discussion today because I want to try to weave all those considerations together, but also share about really cool traditions. So.
Yeah, yeah. Speaking of, let's dive right in because I really want to get into this topic of hoodoo.
Mm.
And what I really want to start with, I want to get into it. You know me, Prince. I want to get into the juice. So let's talk about the misconceptions of hoodoo. Since we're getting into these traditions and we're specifically honing in on hoodoo today, that's a biggie big in the world, period. And since we're specifically targeting the Black community, it's really a big thing in the Black community, the misconceptions about hoodoo. So can you speak on that, please?
Yeah, what are the misconceptions of hoodoo? Again, I want to share that the misconceptions of hoodoo come from outside of us, that were placed on us to convince us not to do the spiritualist practices or no longer carry the spiritualist worldviews that we had to survive. I just want to be clear on that, right?
So
So,
basically, so basically what I'm hearing is they were trying to strip us of our power.
correct.
Oh, okay, just checking. Go
Correct.
ahead. Continue.
Did the show, done. But no, really. And so we see portrayals of African spirituality arising from early, I'm gonna call them pseudo anthropological studies by white slave owners or slaveholding people during early years of enslavement in the 1500s, etc. And they were, seeing some of these spiritual practices happening, deeming them exotic, primitive, retrograde, demonic. We'll see terms used like fetishism, which I'm happy to explain these terms, sorcery, hedonism, right, which is a misnomer, but they would call it hedonistic, which rings particular in the Catholic tradition in particular, dangerous. And even like what's the term I'm looking for like anti-Christian, but essentially it would be like blasphemous, right? Some of these terms were even considered in early texts. So those are
Or
some
hedonistic, is that what one of the terms you were looking for?
hedonistic. Yeah, that was one of the terms that I mentioned,
Okay.
hedonistic, which I'm happy to break that down. But
Is that different than is he or does that come from heathen? Or is that different from
it's
heathenistic?
different. Yeah, no, they're different. So
Okay.
hedonistic, like hedo, is the Greek prefix for like happy. So the idea is like hedonism is hedonism is like extreme happiness or ecstasy. Like, um,
Mm,
yeah, so
mm-hmm.
it's like it would be like getting drunk or
Okay.
getting high, like this kind of lasciviousness or over engaging in sexual intercourse, right? Whatever that would be, right? It's these ideas of like, yeah, just overindulgent is hedonistic. And you're right, right? But heathenistic, right, or heathen is an offshoot of demonic, right? That there's some kind of like primitive dark thing going on, that is considered like low and like very just very rudimentary and um fetishistic, right, or primitive. So yeah, these floating terms are the terms that we see in the literature, and I think in exchange we through time co-opted those terms, right, to say that we are no longer going to do these practices anymore because we don't want to be considered primitive. We don't want to be considered demonic or fetishistic or sorcerous. Um, I you could even question that and play with that a little bit because we know that through time, though some of these traditions, so let me go back. The Europeans, first of all, many Europeans came from countries where there was Christianity, which is the institutional religion, and they
Mm-hmm.
had their own local forms of like spirituality, right? Traditionalist spirituality. The Celtics, right, in Ireland, old some Spanish, right, witchcraft and like different kinds of spiritualist traditions, even in Catholicism. So some of those things existed in old times before Romans conquered Spain and then got co-opted into certain Spanish traditions. There's this like really cool video you see floating around online sometimes. It's a church in Spain where this man just like breaks out of his seat and brings his like 2-year old son up to the altar in the middle of the church. He like just bolts to the front with his son and places the son on the altar in front of the Virgin Mary. Like, and the Virgin Mary's holding Jesus, right? She's got like the globe at her feet, and then she's stepping on like the serpent from Genesis, right? And she's holding baby Jesus, and like, okay, we get the imagery, right? And he's like putting the baby up here, and people aren't really overreacting or gasping, but they are like trying to calm him down. They're not necessarily trying to get the baby down. And so people post it, and then the guy bolts out the church, ultimately, as the comments state. They lock him in the church, right? And eventually he takes the baby home. And people are like, why would he do that? That's so disrespectful during church service. Well, if you know a little bit about Spanish, like mysticism and history, right, you would know that that's an ancient tradition of like literally blessing your child, right? Or and leaving them there or them finding their way home. And that's how you know that they're safe. It is a way of like praying protection over your child through an action. So these were the people that were enslaving most Africans and indigenous people in the hemisphere, right? They also had their own mystical traditions, right? That they brought, that they clandestinely practiced, but who was funding their voyage was the Catholic Church and these larger institutions that were aligned with religious institutions of Europe. So they had to preach stop
Wow.
religion, da, 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 but oftentimes we're continuing, right? Their own mystical traditions. And I mean, there's more there than that, but I just want to confound this idea that all the white people were religious and all the black people were fetishistic and animist.
Right.
Like they like imprinted this religion on it. No, like, yes, but it's not all clear on both sides that everyone's just practicing mainstream institutional religion all the time. And through
Mm-hmm.
time, we've always negotiated what those limits are. What are the limits of institutional religion versus where does ancestral and spiritual practices live and grow? And how do they disappear and reappear through time? Throughout ancient Egypt, right? Throughout Europe, throughout modern day Italy, right? All of these things throughout Europe, right? And all throughout the world ebb and flow, these ideas of institutional modern religion, and then these ideas of like older religions. And there's even like, just ebb and flow of their presence and how they reappear and get and resurge right through time. So I just want to confound what we think about the story of religious transfer and conversion. Right?
Yes, yes. And talk to me, this is a question I had for you before, so I want to bring it to the table because I'm sure other people probably have this question as well. Um, but correct me if I'm wrong, another misconception about hoodoo is that it's voodoo.
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Do you want to
Yeah,
explain that at all?
yes. I want to give a definition for hoodoo. Okay.
Great.
A lot of my words today are coming from a bunch of study, but Yvonne Chirot, she is a professor in the Department of Religion at Swarthmore College, which is not far from where I am right now, actually. And she's a leading scholar here. And I want to mention things that she and others talk about in this space when we're talking on an academic level, right? Hoodoo, in short, is African American magic. It is a umbrella of spiritual traditions of an invisible institution, as this famous religious anthropologist Albert Rabbitoe says. And it's the clandestine sacred life of African American people in many ways. There is no one way to practice it. Okay. There is no one right like idea. But we know from transatlantic slave trade, and we know from history where indigenous tribes came from, and we can see through lines, right, as to where certain traditions, right, kind of draw a direct line from Africa to the New World. So I want to say there is an umbrella of New World spiritual experience that emanates from an African animistic spiritualist core of thousands of groups along, right, throughout Africa, Western, Central, and even Southern Africa, right, in some sense, Eastern Africa, in some sense, Northern Africa, all over Africa, right? And what they do is they take new form and new life in different places in the New World. And so I want to umbrella hoodoo, voodoo, all these things. I want to umbrella them, Santeria, Lukumi, right? I want to umbrella them under New World Africanist spiritual traditions. And what happened to arise out of North America was hoodoo, right? What was
Mm,
born out of Haiti, which has direct connection to Benin, which was conquered by the French in Haiti, French colony. There we go. People are being moved from Benin to Haiti and continuing a cultural practice, right? Despite efforts to right, stop it or stomp it out or suppress that cultural practice. And so voodoo from Benin becomes voodoo of right Haiti. And so I just want to paint them together to say many of these things we're talking about are country specific,
mm,
colonization legacy specific, but the same eminence of like this clandestine continual practice and spiritual connection of animism, right? And belief in conjuring and moving, right? It comes from amalgamized practices from Africa, right?
mm,
So hoodoo is the African American version. And I'll go ahead, Jay Nicole, and just continue and
yes.
say one thing that Dr. Shiro says, she says, quote, I use hoodoo to describe African American traditions of spiritual healing, of ancestral devotion, and protection. So we see hoodoo rather has these three in all the traditions, but in particular in North America, hoodoo has purposes, these three main purposes of healing, ancestral devotion, and protection. And she also talks about these floating terms that we use, right? We use hoodoo. She says hoodoo would be the overarching category of these kinds of practices. Roots or root working or root doctoring refers to the natural and organic objects, rather, the natural and organic objects that we use in the performance of actions to make things happen. right? So the use of natural objects, sticks, leaves, any kind of natural compound or substance would be considered root working, and they would
Mm,
be used for healings, poisonings, supernatural predictions, we call divinations, etc. So the use of some kind of natural object would fall under this umbrella term of roots or root working, root
okay.
doctor. We also have another term, conjuring. And I really like this dichotomy because the word gives you a clue on the sub practice or component of what it's doing, right? So roots, probably using roots. Roots are the thing that's probably used the most. And also, I want to go back and say roots are not just utilized as objects or wands, right? Some of them can be ingested, grounded, made teas out of, right? And a lot of the roots that we consumed grew and consumed or through our own kind of like, makeshift botany on the North American planet, realize that like we're foraging these things, that these plants can be used for something, right? A lot of those
Mhm.
things got co-opted, I will just preliminarily say, into these more generalized health practices and even pharmaceutical practices used by institutions, right? The uses of teas and things like that. But those things have roots, not just in African traditions, but many times in indigenous traditions. And I will say, with root work in particular, we see the indigenous American influence, right? That came about with many African Americans from marooning with indigenous people or intermarrying with indigenous people or inhabiting places where indigenous people were with or without indigenous people and kind of quote unquote reading the tea leaves of the things that they left behind, concerted efforts to grow certain plants. Let's figure out what this plant does, right? Or there might even be an interpersonal transfer of that knowledge from indigenous people who trusted, right, our African ancestors and who are the ones that perhaps intermarried and procreated. Because I will
Mhm.
say, many people who identify as African American in the United States today have indigenous ancestry, right? That's something we don't talk about. That's a whole nother show, right? But many of us do. And there are practices, I'm sure, that live in all of our families that we just don't know why auntie do that or why grandma do that or why great aunt do that, right? But that comes from that. Okay. Second, you have conjuring. Conjuring refers to, right, some kind of calling up. So conjuring refers to the interactions between humans and the spirits of other beings, other humans, angels, saints, ancestors, deities, and even divine beings in the literature like God and Jesus Christ. Okay, now we're getting to some of the charismatic traditions of African American faith traditions that are actually utilizing what anthropologists would refer to in this hoodoo umbrella as conjuring, right? That
Mhm.
idea of talking to people, right? And talking to spirits, even glossolalia, speaking in tongues, right? Many scholars, define these things in many ways. That would be a conjuring, this communication and interaction with spirits, right? From beyond, spirits that we can't not usually see, right?
Mhm.
And so these are kind of some of the floating terms. I'm sure there are others that will appear, but roots, root working, conjuring, right, are just some of those terms that we hear, and that's where they come from. I will stop there because we're gonna explore much more. But what you got, Jake Cole?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I love that. I'm hearing so much crossover between hoodoo and the African American church, as well as hoodoo and this quote unquote new age spiritualism,
Yes.
right? So much, even though hoodoo is a very it's rooted in very old traditions.
Right.
So it's very interesting to see this crossover. I specifically want to talk about how it shows up in the media. Can we talk more about that? How it shows
Yeah.
up in media, media portrayals of hoodoo? Um, yeah, can we talk about that?
Yeah. Okay. the quiet part out loud, media portrayals of our hoodoo traditions are always shrouded in horror,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? Or this fascination with black magic, which we can talk about.
Hmm.
Right. And let me step back and say one of my favorite scholars from Morehouse, right? I guess I was philosophy major at Morehouse. Shout out to
He's a
the
Morehouse
one.
man, y'all. He's a Morehouse
Yeah.
man.
Yes, shout out to the philosophy department at Morehouse. Really, that where I came of age as a thinker and a scholar. I want to put some respect on that after homecoming last weekend. All love.
Yes.
Um, One of my favorite, actually my favorite scholar controversially is Friedrich Nietzsche. I've read
Hmm.
everything he has pretty much ever written incredibly. Some of the stuff near the end of his life isn't incredible, but read everything he's pretty much ever written in undergrad, which is insane. And in both English and French, right? I don't know much German, but reading his text in other languages illuminates much more. Anyway, he talks about how Christianity redefined this dichotomy of not just good and bad, but good and evil, and the turning of bad into evil, right, is how the church has demonized certain people and practices and
Mhm.
behaviors, right? And like other countries and nationalities, ethnicities.
Yeah.
Even now
And I
he would.
just want to say before
Mhm.
you continue and the reason why I brought this up, the crossover between what the hoodoo that I how I'm seeing crossover within this umbrella that you described as hoodoo, the conjuring and the root work and everything within the Black church, as well as within this New Age spiritualism, is because of what you're just describing right now. That there's been such a divide. There's, what you described is there, it's really all together, but there's been this divide where it's like the church and what happens in the church is good, and the stuff that happens with New Age spiritualism is bad and evil and hoodoo. And so
That's
I just wanted to bring context to the question that I'm asking. So go ahead, continue.
Yeah, no, and thank you. Please continue to highlight the crossover, right? Because I want to
Hmm.
make sure people are getting that from our comments, right, and our worldview.
Yes.
And so ultimately, right, I hear that. And
Hmm.
I now Nietzsche would not have that critical race element to say like people became evil, but they did, right? Like ultimately, if I am going to reprise Nietzsche, right, through a critical race lens, I am going to say, that the Christianity turning from good and bad into the dichotomy of now good and evil, bad becoming evil, is exactly like what was done to us in our cultural practices. And before I forget, please, J. Nicole, do not allow me to forget to mention about slave codes, right? And like banning of our religious practices. I want to come back to that. Because
Yes.
that is the ways in which they were legalistically vilified, right? It was
Mm.
really a crime to practice
Hmm.
some of our religious, practices and rites
Hmm.
in hoodoo traditions. But anyway, so now we see portrayals of um African spiritualisms, right, that live in our contemporary life today. As evil and demonic, there's this like obsession over like horror, voodoo dolls, and root doctors in the woods. And I mean, there are all these stories. If you talk about media more broadly, tons of books, right, in the early 20th century written by white people that have gone on these scavenger hunts for um different cultural practices. I'll give you one example, right? Well known in my Gullah Geechee community, Dr. Buzzard of South Carolina, famous root worker, one of the biggest root workers, right, in the country. Many white people over time go down to South Carolina. They're looking for Dr. Buzzard. I won't even say where he's buried, but they're looking for Dr. Buzzard. And they try to find the grave and they write all these books and stories about how they found the grave
Ah.
and the powers of the grave and all this stuff. And, you know, things are hidden for a reason. And I think one of the things that I'm trying to do in this discussion is not, oh, let me tell y'all all the hoodoo I know, and you find it here and you find it there. As someone who works in cultural sustainability is about, we define it as empowering cultural communities to sustain their own life ways,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
not helping somebody else give them the treasure chest guide, right, to finding the value in another community so they can take it and put it in a museum. That ain't the work that I'm doing, and that's not the work that we're doing. So I
Mm-hmm.
want to have this very like erudite academic discussion about it, and I'm willing to share components and sources about it, right? But what I'm not willing to do is like give you all the secrets so you can analyze it and funnel it through your experience. Because if it's not your practice and it's not in your community, there are many people who feel like, right, that culture keeping is keeping it safe from exploitation by
Mm-hmm.
Hollywood, right, from
Come on.
harm by Hollywood. But anyway, of the remnants that people were able to collect, for example, in the experience of Dr. Buzzard, there have been some movies that have been tried to be made. There are books that are written. There's these scavenger hunts that people used to do in the mid 1900s, right, to try to find Dr. Buzzard or find his objects and all these things. Um, and there's an affiliation with Dr. Buzzard that he was evil,
Okay.
right? And there's just this kind of like looking for evil. And that's how Hollywood tends to portray it, right? Coming from written media into visual media. There's just this view of like whatever those black people or indigenous people are doing down there, right? It is dark and like, but it would be cool to mess with it. I also want to say there is a hubris in that like black spirituality is, it can't hurt me because I'm white. So I
Mm.
want to go mess with it and play with it, make a Jenga board and like I just want to play with it because it's not real or it
Mm.
won't really hurt me, right? And I think that is wrong. Okay. A lot of these things are hidden by circumstance and on purpose. And I think too, right, the portrayals of things just being used as good and evil is like really bad, right? Because we're pressing on the evil and not the good. And I will say, in most other worldviews, good and bad is really just like color. It's like black and white. You need the bad because you need the quote unquote
Yes.
dark
Yes.
forces because dark forces play a purpose and pass judgment and bring result, right? But then you have like lighter forces, and light forces are the things that are sweet and good and joy and loving, right? And pleasant. But if we have just a pleasant life, our life would really be hedonistic and vapid of true meaning and depth and exploration and even connection, right? So
Yeah.
we
And
need
and
light
and
and dark.
also just yeah, and think about it like scientifically speaking, if there is no darkness, there is no light. How
There's
can you have light without darkness?
right, right. And so it's more of that symbiotic, causational existence that we understand,
Hmm.
conjure and root work and hoodoo, and that exists in hoodoo. But I will bring it back to the scholars, and I'm speaking way past your question, but I'm speaking to the scholars to say, um, what's so interesting about hoodoo is that um, we know it like instinctively, those that are still connected with the experience whose funnel of it has not passed through the white gaze, right? We know it as really being used for good, and actually the primary reason for the continuance and the evolution and the persistence of hoodoo through time was peoples of African descent in this country and throughout the Americas were using these spiritualist practices to protect themselves, their loved ones, their communities, and their connections. That is actually the purpose of it, because there was something about the institutionalization of Christianity and my oppression together, right? That still doesn't make me feel safe or comfortable or happy. And so, what we needed to do was maintain some practices that were familiar to us, to render safe even the institutional spaces, right? That we inhabit and that we were forced to inhabit, right? In order to stay alive. So it is really hoodoo, and its hiding and its reappearance is really a game of staying alive. And what we know is that the fundamental purpose of hoodoo traditions and the lives of enslaved Africans, and even, shall I say, the resurgence of it today, which I'm sure we'll talk about, is all about protection. And it begs the question, protection from what, right? Which I'll leave bare right now, but happy to talk through that. Yeah.
You can go right into it. Protection from what, Prince? Protection from what? Because, and here's the thing, I I as a spiritualist, and like I grew up very Christian in the Black church, particularly the Baptist church, but really across a Black. I was in the Baptist church. I was in the Black Catholic church, which is a thing. Black
Mhm.
Catholic church is very different than Catholic church,
Absolutely. Right.
than white Catholic church. I grew up in the Pentecostal church, the Kojic church. Like I was in all the churches, but my background is Baptist, if you
Right.
will.
Okay.
Now I'm a spiritualist, and now as and I guess that would be identified, or identified as this new age spiritualism, as I mentioned earlier. And as I do practices like calling upon the ancestors, calling upon deities, gods and goddesses that we've called upon over the ages, seeing how some of these deities are very, very similar to some of the saints and characters in the Bible that we grew up seeing and talking about in our religion, right? And so, going back to that crossover that we were talking about, it's like, there's a reason why the Black church is so very different than the white church. And we all know it's because they were actually keeping these practices that you're talking about, but just changing the names so that they wouldn't be found out
Right.
by their slave owners and things. So that's what they were being protected from. But I want you to speak more on it because you're the expert here. So let's dive into that. And that goes back to your question also, the slave codes and the religious practices, and all of that as well. So the question is, what are we being protected from by using these practices? And and talk about the slave codes and the religious practices from back in the day.
Okay, you did a lot of the work right there. Okay, the clandestine continuance of some of these practices and them being given these doctrinal justifications and names by Black religious institutions is really just like the continuance of these practices or the institutionalization of these practices. There is a word that in this discussion, like a very anthropological or academic erudite way of talking about the difference between Black church and white church, is charisma. They use the term charismatic religious traditions. It's a very academic term, right? So traditional religion would be a priest in a Catholic congregation who made chant in Latin, right? They question that, query that, okay? But anyway, that would be one of the things. And then it would be our tradition of hooping and hollering and speaking in tongues and
Mhm.
praise breaks and right, like, you know, praise dancing and ring shouts, okay? All the things,
Mhm.
okay?
Mhm.
Those were described by um objective observers that typically were not using a language from our traditions or our communities and not really, from our communities probably. They looked at those things and they used the word charismatic. I think this is a very interesting term because what we have in our traditions is charisma, right? The idea is, charisma, this kind of like pizzazz, or as the kids would say, riz, or right, like this, like, you know, X factor of excitement and exuberance and physical movement, right? And glossolalia or eulalic, right? Vocalization, right? Those are the indicators of a charismatic tradition. Okay, cool. So those are the things that got co-opted, right, by some of our religious traditions, I just want to say, right, and become these clandestine, continuing, right, hoodoo practices. Okay. I'll say it. Um, your question, what are we, I wrote it differently.
Okay.
What were we or what have we been protecting ourselves from by
Yes.
continuing practices? Okay.
Yes.
What, first of all, there are the real immediate traumas that an
Mm-hmm.
enslaved person experienced.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes, enslaved people were putting roots in their pocket or like drinking different teas or, putting certain things on their children's heads or on the back of their necks or putting pennies in the shoes or like we're hanging up clothes a certain way, right? Because um, these were number one, ways to keep themselves and their loved ones alive.
Yes.
I mean, one of the things you will see that is ubiquitous around all of these traditions, if you do reading and study from their practices in slavery time, and if you read slave narratives, they like fluently talk about these things as if they were quote unquote real. Yeah, because they're real to them. This is our lived experience through time, right? So, what you'll see is these practices were so that the master would not beat my children, so that the master would not kill my spouse, so that the mistress would not lie on my nephew, right? So that like no white slave owning wrath would come upon us because we knew that our words of begging and pleading not to stop would fall on deaf ears. Jay, let me take this in a direction and I'm going to swerve right back.
Come on.
I remember sharing with you a few weeks ago because we just could be going back and forth with social media sharing stuff.
Yes.
And I was sharing with you the origin of whipping or beating or chastening our children.
Yes.
It was a performative means of protection. And think, oftentimes when our parents or grandparents, depending on how old you are, your great grandparents, I don't know if these kids even get it no more, but oftentimes they would say is, I'm whipping you so the world doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That is code for what would literally happen in slavery.
Right.
A child stole, a toy from the master's house that the master's son was playing with because they probably was playing together, right? But he just took the toy, or the kid said he could have the toy, set him up, whatever.
Yes.
So then that, of course, they're like, where's the toy? Where's the toy? They're looking for the toy and they might find the toy in the slave quarters.
Mm-hmm.
And what they would do is they would say, I'm going to beat that little child. And then the parent would say, no, 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 I'm going to whip him, massa. I'm going to whip him. And they would beat their child
Mm-hmm.
so that they did not withstand the shame or the heartlessness of a much, much worse beating from the slave master. So they made it look grandiose, but it may not have been that hard, okay? Or it may not have been as bad. So oftentimes what we were praying for or protecting ourselves from was physical harm.
Mm-hmm.
Physical harm that was imminent and constant all day, all the time. People are getting, and trigger warning, people are getting raped and beaten and cursed and publicly mocked and maimed through the day, 14-hour days, picking cotton, harvesting, right? I mean, like this was a terrible time. And so this spirituality endured because it was a means of literally protecting people, themselves and their families and their communities to stay physically safe.
Yeah.
Okay, let me bring it to today. We have never felt physically safe in this country.
Come on. I just got chills. I just got chills. Yeah.
Okay, from disappearances like Emmett Till, right? Of like people falsely accusing people and people dying, the lynchings. Shout out to Zora Neale Hurston, hoodoo practitioner herself, right? Who is the anthropologist of the 19th century, right? Our real leading example was a woman of this kind of deep anthropological work to the South. Zora Neale Hurston, exhumed the stories of the hundreds of thousands, probably millions of Black people who were lynched in the South. And the origin of Hollywood, as we know, let's keep it real, the origin of public spectacle in this country was making a public spectacle of our real life horror. It was hangings. People went to hangings and would literally bring popcorn and sit and watch someone die for hours by the hundreds and the thousands. That was a pastime in this country 100 years.
And then and then would take a picture with the corpse afterwards.
Okay.
I've seen those pictures. That's crazy.
So that now fast forward to today, we have the Black Lives Matter movement, right? This concern about police and police force, right?
Mhm.
We've got surveillance and other ways of social control, corporate surveillance. I mean, these are things that I dealt with, right, doing tech policy in my days. But right, these fears of physical attack or abuse, they endure today. Another thing, people would often give, like my grandmother, right, would give us objects or things or prayers as objects or practices to keep us safe along a journey away from home.
Mm.
So fear was not only just imminent being in place on the plantation, fear was also imminent in travel because your plantation knows you, but you might be given a chore or an obligation or a job to go to another plantation and to work. Yes, you were, escorted by overseers, right, to go to that next destination, but anything could happen. In the South, in Florida, you got alligators, right? You have like snakes, you have, wild animals, you have other slave masters that don't know y'all. You've got warring territories. At one time in the Civil War, you had the Union versus the Confederacy, and they shooting people they can't even see through the trees of the woods. And that's Black people also getting shot and killed and maimed in travel, being kidnapped in travel. So, right, those are also the reasons why um Black people wanted to stay safe. So I'm like, going deep with this question, but essentially, um the idea of the primary reason was for physical protection, being protected from physical harm. And I think that just obviously transposes to not just the physical harm that we endure in this country on the daily basis and the country that is built on this principle at our expense, but also the psychological, the spiritual maiming. Also, think about families separating, family separation, big topic in immigration law right now. That's
Mhm.
exactly what slavery was. It was like perpetual family separation. And so oftentimes people would mark their children or give their children objects that they may remember their birth mother or that they
Mm.
may remember, right, where people come from. That people, I mean, I chills, right? Because thinking about you giving birth to a human being and that human being just literally just getting taken from you. Or
Mhm.
you're the person just constantly caring for these human beings that you are told and made to treat as objects, but something in you just won't let you. And you
Mhm. Mhm.
still show these innumerable number of children that just pass through your arm and pass through your bosom, going somewhere else. Love and prayer and conjuring and protection and safety that that child may still find a fulfilling life.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
These are the reasons why, right? We practice and maintain these tools to protect ourselves. And to this day, right, we're talking about the way Black children are disappearing. Every time we walk into a Walmart,
Mm-hmm.
beyond the checkout line, right above customer service, all these photos of disappearing young people. Where are young people going?
Right.
Kidnapped, stolen, a quiet
Mm-hmm.
crisis in this country. So we are still under very imminent, persistent, and never cessing threat of physical, emotional, spiritual, and relational trauma. Just irrevocable, irrepressible trauma. And spirituality is how we deal with those things. It's a very long answer, but
Yeah.
the deep answer, right?
Yeah, yeah. And just going back to the origins, I just want to make this clear. I know we know, and
Yes.
but I think we've kind of been glossing over it a little bit. And just in case there are people watching that may not be clear, that back when we did come over from Africa, we carried our traditions with us, but Christianity was forced upon us. And, we've kind of been talking, glossing around it. But I wanted to make it clear that that's why there's such crossover and why there is such a marrying of the hoodoo practices within the Black African American church, going back to then, because the Christianity was forced upon us back then. And again, I know most people watching this probably know that, but I just wanted to be clear, just in case there was somebody watching that does not know that. So going back to that, you talked about that the terminology that has been used to describe the difference between the Black church and the quote unquote white church is charismatic. So I'm just curious if now things have been reversed, is evangelical churches, the white evangelical churches, is that appropriation, Prince?
I mean, yeah, it is, right? It is. So this is confounding, but I'm gonna make this plain.
Okay.
I remember one of my favorite books of all time. It was one of the first books I read and cried reading it as a freshman in college. Was Souls of Black Folk by W.B. Du Bois.
Mm.
And in it, there's a line I'll never forget. I read that thing long 15 years ago, but I still remember he talked about, and I don't want to botch the line, but it was something like he went to was at a Black church, and he's a sociologist that is dipping his toe into anthropology, okay, or qualitative sociology, okay, experiential sociology, anthropology, right? And he goes to a Black church and he says, the loud music, I think it's something like the loud music, the fury, and the frenzy. I think that
Mm.
was the line that he like recalled as his anthropological observation of the practices. Now, right, he is acting as anthropological sociologist, right, and describing the environment, but he's using words that English avails to him and that the discipline of sociology, which had not been challenged, right, from this white lens and white gaze of observation of other, right? He co-opts that language to describe what is happening in a place that he would be familiar with. This is very interesting. I think that's very interesting.
Mm.
And what we know is that this is sensitive. The white charismatic traditions, you have to think, people, yes, it is cultural appropriation. Some cultural appropriation, it's some of it is circumstantial, and while pejorative may be so endemic and constant and sustained over time that it really becomes something else. There is a cultural genesis, right, that it becomes something else. One example of that are like the snake charmers of Appalachia, this white charismatic tradition that uses rattlesnake venom and rattlesnakes in service. They're literally reading Genesis and other verses in the Old Testament. And I'm not just Genesis, they're reading Exodus, excuse me, and other verses in the Old Testament and Genesis and other places where Moses used snakes, right? What many people don't understand is the modern symbol of medicine in this country, right? The two snakes on a staff.
Yeah,
That comes
yeah.
from Moses. That was the symbol that God ordained Moses to create as this kind of pseudo idol, right? That God ordained him to create for the people to focus on.
Mm, wow.
So, right. So, like, there is this co opting. So now we see the snake and Moses, and then we see the rattlesnake being an endemic part of the American, right, landscape that we found here. And now, fast forward, we got a charismatic Christian tradition in Appalachia where white people, where black people once were, but now we're white people or white descending people, white influence has resurged. And they practice a charismatic tradition system utilizing snake venom. It's a rereading of Moses.
Mm,
And it's a co-opting of Africanist and indigenous spirituality in the area because indigenous people also use snakes for many reasons. Okay. And many peoples in Africa also used live snakes because of all of their vibrant colors, right? And things as live jewelry. Snakes were used as live jewelry. Kings and queens and royalty literally wore living animals because you don't have to kill something to wear it as fashion.
wow.
Okay. That is a deep part right there. But anyway. So that is a perfect example of, okay, that appropriation happened long ago, but it is so endemic and it is so constant and it has literally become its own tradition that it is a tradition. Now, I'm not advertising for cultural appropriation and just appropriate it long enough till it becomes your thing. That's dark, okay? And like that is not the ethic and the spirit to which I'm mentioning. But what I'm saying is the transmission of charisma and charismatic tradition from Black people to white people comes by way of their proximity. On a
Yeah.
plantation, you are always and constantly proximate. That's why surveillance is possible. That's why Black people felt unsafe. And might I add, that is why the Gullah Geechee tradition is a very interesting tradition because there was relative um privacy and autonomy on these sea islands, right? That were far from the mainland because plantations were on the mainland. Okay, the largest plantations were on the mainland, but Black people were able to live in some sense of autonomy on rural islands and keep our African retentions, right? I be Gullah Geechee. So that we were able to retain some of our retentions that way. So there was some exchange, but that exchange is mere acknowledgement. But there are some areas where the proximity between master and enslaved person was so close that there's this kind of like almost imperceptible transfer of, cultural practice and co-opting that happened. And who was an enslaved person to tell a white person that they could not hoop or holler? Right? Who is they to tell them to stop that? So it is interesting, right, that after a while that some of this becomes endemic to a community. I do think there is a more rapid, right, acceleration of charisma into white traditions that I think is less ethical. Okay. But right, I don't want to just like wholesale discredit people practice, okay? Because granted, even though they are the descendants of those that enslaved us, right? Culture lives in all people. I mean, I just want to disavow people of color got culture, white people have no culture. That is not true.
Right.
Everyone has a culture because a culture is a set of practices and life ways between people of a same ethnicity, community, clan, or interest group. Okay. So those practices of communication, that is nonetheless a culture. I just want to disavow that. Culture is a human phenomena of socializing. It might
Mhm.
be a different culture, and there's culture borrowing and appropriation and culture mending and cultural genesis, right? But everyone has a culture, but we're seeing cultural transfer of charismatic traditions from African and indigenous traditions into right white religious traditions through this means of proximity through time, through some of the older traditions, but then also just through straight up co-opting. Like I'm on YouTube, I'm watching these people hoop and holler. I'm gonna practice in my house till I figure out how to hoop and holler, and I'm gonna go to seminary and start a church and hoop and holler. So some of that is happening, right? And that's disingenuous, but some of it is really by way of circumstance. right? Without pointing any finger. And right, it's here now, right? And I also want to say you mentioned Christianity heavily. This was
Mhm.
a largely Christian country, but
Yeah.
Christianity was not the only Abrahamic religion that traveled with Black people to this country and white people to this country.
Okay.
Islam played a
Okay.
very large role, in particular, how some hoodoo and traditionalist practices chant. Many people say there's some very rough study. I don't want to cite anyone here, but this study has been done. I've read a few studies like this about the Gullah Geechee ring shout, right? How it is counterclockwise. So I always say this, who invented the clock? White people
Hmm.
in Europe, okay? Everything else is typically counterclockwise. Whoever said the clock had to go that way, and why did everything have to go that way? Because the clock go that way. Okay. Most traditions actually do things counterclockwise. Okay. And that counterclockwise motion of the ring shout looks a lot like the counterclockwise motion going around the Kabbalah, right? During Hajj
Mhm.
in Mecca, which looks a lot like this kind of Kabbalistic singing and moving around the fire and religious objects that existed even long before Islam in Central
Mhm.
Africa, modern day Congo. Okay. So there is some exchange between religions, right? Even other Abrahamic religions that are not Christian, right? And we see some of those remnants in our cultural practices, some of the singing and the chanting, right? And even some of the physical movements, right? And bowing. Some of those things have found their way into Hoodoo traditions and Christian traditions. And then we also have Judaism. Judaism played an outsized role, as you know, right? It plays an outsized role, right, in Black spirituality. And two ways: in the ways that we lean heavily on the Old Testament and the Old Testament experience of Israelites being freed from slavery as kind of our calling as chosen people that were chosen for this voyage to come to America, right? And to then experience God and freedom in these very like tortuous, objectively tortuous circumstances, right? Like there's some overlines on that. That is borrowing from the Judaistic tradition of text. But also, we have there's a lot of stuff in the Old Testament as well that are practices that mirror the mystical and spiritual practices that Africans would have known of, right?
Mhm.
Things like the 12 spies, things like, right, people touching the Ark of the Covenant and there's the coveted objects and being struck dead and like the Ark having powers and the Ark taking up no space. I mean, all of those things that are in the text, right, were things that would resonate with an African because they come from animistic traditions where a lot of those things are being used. So there is this inter-religious conversation by way of African spirituality through the mind of an enslaved African that has some recall of their past. And they would read that in the Old Testament. So that's why white slave masters were editing Bibles and taking things. And it wasn't just free the slaves and all of that. Some of the stuff they were taking out or forgot to take out were these practices of mystical, old Semitic mystical practices that find their way in the Old and New Testaments. Right. And that's a
Mhm.
whole nother conversation. I mean, I'm focusing this on the African American experience, right? But clearly there are other, right, mystical traditions that coexist in the Middle East, right? That are from religions that are much, much older than Christianity, even much, much older than Judaism, that coexist and that find their ways into these texts. So we think that Abrahamic religions and traditions in their due respect, right? As someone who descends from people and who practices Abrahamic tradition myself, right? I want to put respect on it, but I also want to take a historiological, right, and more anthropological lens on the text that we're reading and how it would be interpreted and reinterpreted by an enslaved African in this experience, right? That's a long
Mm.
answer, but yes, that's it. That's it.
So knowledgeable. We love it. We love it. We love it. Before I ask you this last question, I just want to say to the people who are watching, we want to hear from you. So in the comments below, please tell us about any hoodoo practices that you practice yourself, that you have experienced through your family or your cultural tradition or your religious tradition, and or any of the crossovers or anything that you have seen or experienced. We want to hear about your experiences. So please go ahead and put those in the comments below, and or if it's something really sensitive, personal to you, you can send it to Prince the Culture Keeper himself at his email address at Culture Keeper Prince at on IG in his DMs, or his email address, which is prince@goldwaterventures.info. So if you're able to, but put them in the comments though, because we want to all read it. All right. I have this last question that I want to ask you that I think is really important, which is why I'm saving it for last. And that is going back to this idea of appropriation that we were just talking about. What is the line between appropriation and appreciation? And how can we respectfully appreciate cultures? How can outsiders respectfully appreciate cultures?
I'm gonna attack this question from another way first.
Okay.
I want to speak to, and I'm going to answer a question, but I'm going to do it in a bigger way. To answer multiple
Mhm.
questions people got at the same time. Okay.
Right.
First, you may be a person of African descent, and you may be curious about these traditions. You may have a longing or a desire to practice these right practices, traditions, these spiritualists, these umbrella of African spiritualities that still exist among us. Do not be listening to these internet hustlers. Do not be going out buying objects from any which way, and be trying to read and do stuff in your house disconnected from community, because hoodoo practices and culture, period, always exist in community. Always, always. Okay.
That's good. That's
And
good.
right. So, and also there's a spiritual reason. You do not know what you are locking or unlocking when you do that. I highly suggest that you do not. What you should do is do some research and connect yourself as much as possible to a reputable, large community of practitioners that are willing to teach you.
Mm.
But I highly discourage, okay, just going on TikTok and just taking stuff people tell you. Highly recommend it. Do your own research, find something that resonates with you, and be in community. I think in a large, reputable, and long-standing community to do it. I will also say hoodoo is a phenomena that we are ascribing to North America. Okay. Different regions and states, and they do different things. So don't be like, well, this is hoodoo because we do it like this and y'all don't do it like that. Real traditional, continual hoodoo practitioners understand regional differences, but are able to speak the same language.
Mm.
So that would show me you don't know what you're talking about, okay? If you were to, right, essentially like discount other regions or experiences because they're not like the one that you know or the one that you think you know.
Mhm.
Number three, what do we do if we're totally cut away and a tradition is near erasure? The words we call erasure in culture. Cultures don't go extinct. They're not animals. Cultures they become erased, right? So before a culture is completely erased, what are the things that we can do to kind of like preserve or restart a tradition, right? If it has been disappeared. We there's something in the work that we do, academics, but also in the practicing work of cultural sustainability, right? I am a cultural sustainability advocate and practitioner. We do the work with Afro-Indigenous communities throughout the Americas, okay? And my community as well. What we call that is we call that cultural revitalization. That happens
Mm.
when a culture has completely disappeared. And there is what we do. No, excuse me. Cultural revitalization is when it's near death.
Yeah, yeah.
Like you're trying to bring it back to life, right? Like you would jumpstart a heart, right? You're trying to bring a tradition that is near the flat line back up. But if a tradition has completely disappeared or erased, what we do is cultural reconstruction. We reconstruct what the culture is, but we don't do that on our own. We do that with experts. We do that with elders. We do that with people who have a remnant of what we're looking for. We do that prayerfully. We do that ethically. And one of the ways that we've often done that through time, reconstruct traditions of indigenous communities that are no longer, or right, African spiritualities that are no longer, right, from the New World or Africa. What we do is there's typically a group that is adjacent to it that still exists.
Mm.
Many peoples from cultures that are being erased subsume into the neighboring community that may have once been an enemy tribe or enemy community, but oftentimes find them as refuge. That culture may live there. So if you're from that community, you're looking to reconnect with that. That is one of the ways that we would composite sources that become the basis of cultural reconstruction. It's what we do with ancient Egypt. Are there any ancient Egyptians walking around today? No. Okay. But what we've done, right, is reconstruct. And we know, if I may just write the example, there are places where Black ancient Egyptians or Kemeticians or comedians, right, went. Right, modern day Sudan, Ethiopia, right? So those Coptic and those East African traditions, many of them hold some of the ancestral knowledge, right? Of ancient Egypt. How we know that too, a real example of that is for centuries, we never knew how to read ancient Egyptian. There's a Rosetta Stone and some other stuff.
Hieroglyphs. The
Hieroglyphs, thank you.
hieroglyphs.
Hieroglyphs,
Hmm.
right? Or even how to pronounce them. Like I'm talking about the
Hmm.
phonology. Like okay, that's a bird. Okay, that's a pyramid. Okay, that's a human looking left. Okay, that's a person with a, hat looking right. Okay. But like, how do we say it?
Right.
But it's actually the Egyptian Coptic church and the Coptic language that became our clue that unlocked how we think we've reconstructed what ancient Egyptian language sounded like. That is the perfect example of cultural reconstruction in the absence of a culture, in the absence of an ancient Egyptian who speaks it fluently today to tell us what it says, right? But what you're hitting on is like, just because these things are possible does not mean we should do it.
Mm.
Okay. And so I want to say two things. I'm going to speak to that and then go back to the core of your question directly. There are traditions that have died, that have erased, that have disappeared. They may or may not resurge again. And what I posit as someone who does cultural sustainability work, as sometimes it was the will of the people to erase it.
Mm. Interesting. Okay.
And respect that. Just because you might be able to reconstruct something doesn't mean you're the one to reconstruct it, right?
Right.
So it boils down to integrity and ethics and intention,
Mm.
right? What is your intention? Are you like, analyzing and intellectualizing someone's tradition? That reeks to us of museumification and cultural preservation, where you're just preserving me like a mummy. You're mummifying my culture, right? And trying to practice it without me.
Mm.
No, okay, that is not what my firm does. That is not what I do. But what we want to do again is empower people to retain and sustain their cultural lifeways. Sustaining might be going back and reconstructing something, but you know if that's right for you. And I ask you to rely on forces and like experiences and your experiential and supernatural homage and respect and seeking to find whether that's something you should be doing. Because sometimes things disappear for a reason and they're not meant to be known to the Western world or the outside world. Okay. And then finally, for those who are not of a culture, I highly, highly recommend that you leave it alone. If you are curious about something, that's what academic literature is for. Go ahead, right? Enjoy it, read it. If you're curious about certain practices, try to find people who are experts, who hold themselves out as people who know the culture, right? And who have that community, and ask them. And you can ask them the questions that you would like, but accept their no if they choose not to tell you. Accept their no if they choose not to tell you. And how you can best do that is munch on the information you can find, and you can intellectualize about it and search and set up an RSS feed, thing and try to find it when it comes and things pop up. But don't go looking and exploring in places where you are uninvited, in a culture and a community where you are uninvited. I highly recommend you do not do that. So this is
Don't
really the
be a
thing.
culture vulture.
Don't be a culture vulture is
Yes.
exactly my point. And
Mhm.
so, with that, I say that's the in-group, out-group conversation, to be really frank. But there typically is someone who has maintained a cultural practice. Typically, there's usually someone or some folk. And I reckon to say more often than not, they are networked together and they will feel you out. If they
Mhm.
want to indoctrinate you and introduce you to the traditions, and they will suss out your meaning and your purpose and your intention. But in your seeking, make your intention pure.
Come on, preach.
That's all I.
This has been incredible. Such wisdom, such knowledge, such information. This is good information, Prince. This is such good information. I know I learned some things today, and we already had talked about what we was going to talk about. So the fact that I learned some things, I know the people watching done learn some things. So thank you for sharing dropping your pearls, sharing your wisdom.
Thank
This has
you.
been really, really great and informational and helpful for
Thank you.
myself, and I'm sure a lot of people watching. Please drop your stories of your hoodoo traditions that you practice, that you've experienced, and any crossovers and things. And listen, if you want to talk about some appropriation you've experienced, we're here for that too.
Please,
We're here for that too. So go
please.
ahead and drop in the comments. And also, if there's something that's sensitive that you don't necessarily want to share with the world, we encourage you to be open and transparent and authentic. But some stories are very sensitive. If you want to share it privately, then Prince. So I don't F it up again. Can you just go ahead and tell the people the best way to send it to you privately?
Yes, so you could either inbox me, DM me on Instagram at Culture Keeper Prince, or you can email me at prince@goldwaterventures.info, all conventional spelling. And I would love to hear what things that you have and love to put them in conversation with other traditions if I can, right?
Boom. There it is. Thank y'all so much for watching. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Jay Nicole. Thank you for hosting.
Yes.
Boom, done.
This was fun.
You learned a lot for real. I went in, girl.
I did. Seriously. Yeah.
I didn't
Yeah,
mean to
yeah,
go
yeah.
in.
Just like I think one of my takeaways um was the reminder to be in community when doing these practices, because sometimes I can withdraw. Like I'll be in community when I learn the practice or when I'm starting to do the practice, and then take it with me and just withdraw.
Right,
you
right.
know, yeah.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I think that that is, and I mean, I can either put this on an outtake or whatever. Wearing white today is not an accident. Okay.
Okay, okay.
Not having my blue background up, not an accident, but wearing an indigo dyed blue cloth, right? Not an accident. Okay.
Mhm.
So, my bracelets, right? Something I
Mhm.
wear. If you know me, I wear them all the time. I
Mhm.
very
Mhm.
rarely take them off. Um, there's just meaning behind even doing this today. But I think that
Oh,
one,
I forgot to say that. Shit, I'm so sorry. I
yeah,
meant
we
to
could
say
cut
that
it
part.
in. Say,
Okay. This is on a very special day. Today is All Saints Day. We just celebrated Halloween yesterday. We're celebrating All Saints Day today, and we're celebrating All Souls Day tomorrow. So this is happening on a very special weekend.
yes, yes, this is a very high spiritual time. Jay Nicole, I also saw, Halloween, El Dia de los Muertos, right, for Mexicans and other traditions. What's so interesting is that practice has really proliferated around Latin America, but we've also uncovered other Latin American traditions doing it anyway. But Mexico was the one that people like saw as the most elaborate, right? And there is a similar practice done, um, number one, in New Orleans, actually. There is a particular practice where people go to graves. Because there are a lot of like white, gravestones from old ancestors. They brush them off. They, pray around them. They talk to their ancestors. They put um adornments and food items, right, and rum and different things for different reasons. A lot of those are an umbrella of traditions, right, throughout the Americas, of ancestor veneration and communion, and afterlife communication. It would be conjuring, if you will, right? And right, like that happened yesterday, so it's not just something that's happening in Mexico. I will also say in the Gullah Geechee Nation, we also celebrate a day of remembrance of our ancestors today, actually. It's happening. I think the main one is happening down in Florida today. And also today was the day. I'm sorry that I couldn't make it. But we were going to a burial site in Florida, a very like precious and special place where our ancestors who worked in the timbering fields for an old company in our county. They pretty much industrially captured the county. Long story short, this land now owns the corporate actor, and they discovered these grave sites. Even though we always knew they were there and always tended to our graves. Grave tending is a practice that is ubiquitous. Right? We don't leave our loved ones there and don't tend our graves. Grave tending on holidays, on birthdays, right? That is a means of ancestral veneration that you may be Christian, but you still do it, right? Oftentimes, and I heard this from what's her name? Auntie Bev, like the one that does the spelling stuff on Instagram. Anyway, she does the words, like the different like vocabulary words. She actually shared something yesterday in the spirit of Halloween. The difference between a cemetery and a graveyard. Do you know the difference?
No.
Yes, this is so interesting. She says that a cemetery is just a place where the deceased are buried. But a graveyard is typically a cemetery attached to a church.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
Isn't that deep?
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I will say some practices, very interesting, would be done in cemeteries, but many of the earliest practices that we know, right, of like conjuring and the hoodoo traditions happen in graveyards
Yeah.
because of their proximity to churches, but also because the church was the institution burying people.
Hmm.
And right, that is people would be buried at their church, right?
Hmm.
So, right, church graveyards now are like very rare. But ultimately, right, that was where a lot of the continuing traditions of conjuring lived. And I can't harp enough. I know I'm going back into it. I don't mean to, but you're right. A lot of these traditions were co-opted into the church, right? A lot. Honestly, there is no place where African spirituality lives most than in our funeral rites.
Mm,
That is, in my experience, right, in my relatively recent experience, where I, as a pseudo ethnoanthropologist, right, like encountered it. And it's one thing to study it academically, and I've written about it and all this stuff. It's another thing to live it and then to understand more holistically why we do certain practices and why we don't, right? Why there
mhm.
are things we do and don't do at various times. Why are there these kind of like culturally automated responses? Why does family, oh, such and such pass, oh, we got to bring them food? You know, why there are reasons for that, right? Those there are some spiritual practices that are there. Wakes and like, a lot of those things, right? A lot of those things are um
Repast, all of that. Yeah.
all of that, right, has some African spirituality baked and built into it. That still pays homage to Jesus or Allah or right,
Yeah.
God in the way that you call them. But nonetheless, right, it does have a little Afro-Indigenous spice on it, right, of ancestral veneration and practice and root
Right.
work, conjuring, and other stuff, other cool stuff we do. So.
Yeah. You know how you know something in instinctively, but you don't know how to articulate it. You don't know that you
Yeah.
know it. You just that's what it was for me with the cemetery graveyard question because
Mm.
I knew from a very young age the difference between a graveyard and a cemetery, but I could not even now until you just told me the difference articulate it. But I can remember driving through the highways, the back roads of Ohio. That's where I'm from, y'all. I'm from Ohio, and seeing like the old churches and the graveyards next to the churches and knowing that that was a graveyard and then getting back to my home in the city and where the cemetery was and knowing that that was a cemetery and knowing the language, knowing that that was a cemetery, knowing that those were graveyards, but I couldn't tell you why. Like I could maybe describe the difference, like, oh, a graveyard generally, like the graves are older and they're like it's smaller and things like that. I could describe like the aesthetic difference of generally speaking. But yeah, I never knew the technical, like I wasn't ever able to articulate or know the specific difference, but I instinctively knew the difference between a graveyard and a cemetery. So that's interesting.
Oh, wow. I did not like I think you're right. I think we instinctively did know it, but I couldn't articulate it until she said it. And I was like, oh no, you're
Hmm.
right. That would be a graveyard. Like, oh wow.
Hmm.
That is so
Hmm.
great. And there was something else, Jay Nicole, that popped up in my mind. I didn't talk too much about slave codes, but I'll get it down. Right? These concerted, I'll say it now. I'll chop it in. So when we talk about slave codes, right? We are talking about, right, and I'm doing deep academic and legal history and study of the laws since the origin of this country, right, that have suppressed our cultural lifeways. And there are periods of suppression and reasons for suppression. And I gotta say two things. First, slave codes were passed, and a lot of them prohibited our congregation together without supervision. And a lot of our practice of cultural traditions that have spiritual significance, like drumming, right? Or literally objects that people would deem as paraphernalia of fetishism, right? Though there are a lot of laws like that or that coded with that kind of language, right, that were passed to make us stop our religious spiritual practices. Okay. That is because what became painfully obvious during the Haitian Revolution. So it's so interesting because people talk about the Haitian Revolution. Oh, it was, it was a 12-year protracted war from like the 1790s to like 1804. And then they, Toussaint Louverture and the whole crew freed everybody, all the enslaved people in Haiti, etc. Many non-us scholars say, oh, it was because the war and this and that, da, da, da. They have these very scripted reasons why it did not work. But many of us and Black scholars talk about the Haitian Revolution, and one of the reasons why it was victorious is because it was God against God. And that it was I'm a sociologize it, okay? It is the it's common language and belief in Afro spirituality, African spirituality, and that being a rallying force that everyone instinctively understood and responded to, that was able to cohesively like form and empower an army of enslaved people to defeat their oppressors, to fight for 12 years and not stop till they won. So this Africanist spirituality had so much power. One of the unspoken reasons why many of the slave codes increased in their number and severity and like suppression of our life ways, thinking about more innocuous things that we would do that white people were suspicious of. So they wrote laws about them to make us stop them, came from this ubiquitous, perpetual, international white fear of the
Mm.
power of African spirituality, and it being probably one of the reasons why um, Haiti freed itself. And I'm gonna tell you something many people don't know. Delegations of Haitians over time came to Savannah, Georgia. Why Savannah, Georgia during enslavement and Reconstruction? Why Savannah, Georgia? If you know anything about Savannah, Georgia, first, indigenous people live there, and it's very swampy land. White people came, killed all the indigenous people, and some horrible things happened there. So many people say Savannah is haunted. Not going to peddle in that. People say that. There's a reason why people say that, okay? So then as white settlers like began living and killing people, they essentially like built these graveyards. Some people died, right? They built these graveyards. And literally the city of Savannah is built on sinking graveyards, like decades and decades, generations and generations and generations of graveyards that literally have solidified the land so stop from sinking.
Wow.
Not an accident in this Gullah Geechee region that Haitian delegates would try to make their way to Savannah, Georgia as a place of spiritual conjuring
Mm.
and welcoming, perhaps by
Mm.
indigenous energy, perhaps by African energy, right? And it was a place where they were trying to help inspire a cousin slave rebellion.
Got it.
So there was still this effort by Haitians. Haitians didn't just free themselves and be like, all right, we done. There was
Mm.
still this effort to go back for each other. I think that's very important in this moment for two reasons. The political, racist scapegoating and attacking of Haitians
Mm.
should be spiritual. For us should be spiritual. And for us is a five-alarm fire of like systemic and like eons long and continuing anti-Black racism.
Yes. Yes.
And I want to examine the fact that spirituality plays a role in our knowledge of self and our freeing of ourselves.
Yes.
Whatever religious practice you may think, many blame, right, the Black church for the reason why we got civil rights, right? The reason why we got all of these major legislative movements, it's because of the community and the spiritual revival and the, dare I say, conjuring of spirit toward a common goal and cause that made people stop going to school and start sitting in lunch counters and going to jail and having righteous protests and like literally just laying their bodies prostrate into the fray of violence and disappearance to make change. That by attrition, we were just going to throw our bodies against change until it happened.
Yes.
That isn't logical or normal. That's spiritual. That is Africanist spirituality, right? Living through an institution that we know and that we largely respect and trust. So I believe this movement of Afro spirituality has always existed. It lives in its new ways. And you don't have to goose chase this desire for the pure, like what did the enslaved person do in 1635? You don't have to do that. It lives and it ebbs and it flows and it evolves to its environment, but it is always and ever present among us. You just have to look.
Yes.